America that he felt represented the indispensable nation, and that was losing its sense of cultural cohesiveness and moral core. And his book was in some ways an attempt to restate the value of that moral core, so that the dominant world power could act with more grace in the world and so not mess things up. Sadly, I guess, America did not take Samuel Huntington's advice. And like many, big books in world history, his work was probably also sadly misunderstood. Concepts of modernisation and social development, all these sorts of things, these are all similar ways of talking about the rise and fall of civilizations as an organic or natural system. I think, as well as looking at Fernandez Amesto's book, though, there is one other great book by British historian John Darwin called After Tamerlane, The Rise and Fall of Global Empires 1400 to 2000, that wrestles with these same problems, but ultimately does not make the mistake of viewing great states as civilizational entities linked to religion and bound up in a cohesive life story in the way that Samuel Huntington, with all his subtlety, ended up doing. John Darwin's book, After Tamerlane, really responds to three big themes, and it's these themes that we've been talking about as the ones that people have wrestled with in trying to understand the rise of the West and what is the civilizational impact or the civilizational secret source of the West. The big three themes were the globalization, which when Darwin wrote it or published it in 2007 had been talked about, for a long time and quite intensively. But also the dominance of Europe and later the West. But then John Darwin had a different theme, more perhaps echoing Fernandez Amesto's work, which less pessimistic about or less assumed less about the extent of Western control of other cultures than the traditional accounts of the rise of the West, because he really emphasised the resilience of the states of Eurasia for a very long time, and he gave a proper account of the role of that extraordinary state, that multi-ethnic empire, Russia, in his account. But similarly, the states based around what we'd call Iran and China were surprisingly dominant, and indeed Japan was also strong enough to be itself an imperial power in the early 20th century. So if I read from towards the end of John Darwin's book, he says, at the start of this book it was argued that the shape of today's world cannot be explained away as the product of a global economy and its political and cultural side effects. Behind the variations of wealth and power, the divergence of institutions and values, and the differences in cultural and religious attachment that are still so visible in the 21st century world, lies a much more complex history of competitive empire, state, and culture building. So rather than a story of civilizations, he's talking about at least three layers of competing institutions, their empires, states, and cultures, and variations on many different factors as well, like institutions, values, culture, religious attachment. While he says this story is often portrayed as the brutal saga of predatory imperialism, the West's invasion as the hapless. So he contrasts two competing false views. That one is that the story is a saga of predatory imperialism, the West's invasion of the hapless non-West, and the other is the history of the world is the long march to modernity, with the West as a guide and using its template. Neither one is true, and that is, I guess, the ultimate summary of what we've been talking about in this episode. There is no neat chronology of imperial rise and fall, no neat geography of European mastery over the rest of Eurasia, nor indeed did the empire, in quote marks, of the West come to the end in the bonfire of colonial vanities that we call decolonization. There are three big themes in his work, and they are really about the complex imperial histories and the fact that there were these things called empires, including that of the American Empire. And secondly, a pattern of persistence, that there were surprisingly strong resistance to Europeans' domination of Asia in Manchuria, Mongolia, Xinjiang and Tibet and other places. And that this was cultural as well. Religion, language, literature, and sort of non-state loyalties. So when Oswald Spengler was talking about the decline of the West in 1911, the West's cultural impact might seem to have been at an all-time high, but it was also facing well-organised resistance from many areas. For example, Gandhi, Tolstoy, the emerging sort of Islamist movement in various places, and of course the sort of growing sort of nationalism in China. This third grand theme is around convergence, and this is the convergence that ultimately ends in the extraordinary unipolar moment after the end of the Cold War. And this is what John Darwin has to say about that, remembering he wrote his work about, 15 years ago. The economic regime to which we have grown used in the last decade and a half represents an extraordinary moment in the turbulent history of the global economy. It was produced by an earthquake as dramatic as anything in the world's modern history. It required the combination of geopolitical change, the sudden collapse of Soviet power and China's decision to embrace a market economy, and a technological revolution in communications and transport. The turn to the market in the People's Republic and the former Soviet bloc brought a massive enlargement of productive capacity and an enormous new market. It coincided with the growth of much cheaper air travel, the container revolution, and above all, the commercial application of internet technology. Hard on the heels of the financial liberalisation of the 1980s that brought much greater freedom for financial services and capital transfers between Western countries, the conditions were met for a phase of exceptional growth in the volume of trade and an intense integration of economic activities on a global scale far beyond the limited promise of the pre-1914 world. The great divergence in wealth and economic performance between the Euro-Atlantic West and most of the rest of Eurasia has given way instead to the great convergence, which should, if it continues, restore the balance to the rough equilibrium of half a millennium ago in the next 50 years. That is, if you like, the end of the West. But all of this has been underpinned by the building of empires, states and cultures with distinctive values, attitudes, institutions and ideologies. It can't all go into a great big globalization blancmange. So, just like Oswald Spengler in 1911, John Darwin evokes a sense that we are on a brink of a great transformation, But perhaps he does not get as carried away with prophecy as Oswald Spengler, because he notes that this great transformation has been occurring through these complex processes, not just of civilizations clashing, but of empires, states, cultures, values, attitudes, institutions, ideologies, social structures, I guess, for a long time. The history of Asia, he says, suggests that while new methods of warfare and government, new techniques of production, new cultural practices, and new religious beliefs were diffused from one end of the old world to the other and from every direction, they failed to induce a common view of modernity, or of what it was to be modern. The past patterns of trade and conquest, diaspora and migration that have pushed and pulled distant regions together and shaped their cultures and politics have been exceptionally complex. Their effect has been not to homogenize the world, but to keep it diverse. I might add, multipolar perhaps in brackets. By contrast, the magnetic force of the global economy, or in brackets, liberal rules-based order, has been too erratic thus far and too unevenly felt to impose the cooperative behaviour and cultural fusion to which theorists of free trade have often looked forward. What we call globalization today might be candidly seen as flowing from a set of recent agreements, some tacit, some formal, between the four great economic empires of America, of the contemporary world: America, Europe, Japan, and China. For them and for all other states and societies, the challenge will be to reconcile their internal cohesion with the disturbing effects of free competition. The strain will be great, the outcome uncertain. But if there is one continuity that we should be able to glean from a long view of the past, it is Eurasia's resistance to a uniform system, a single great ruler, or one set of rules. In that sense, we still live in Tamerlane's shadow, or perhaps more precisely, in the shadow of his failure. And that, I think, is perhaps the more compelling account of world history that ultimately, I think, supports the view that we must learn to live in a multipolar, multicultural, fragmented and complex and ever-changing kaleidoscopic world, not in a world of Netflix and international rules-based order. There is an old adage that history is written by the victors. I don't think you can really read after Tamerlane or Fernandez, Amesto, or many other modern-day historians, even older historians, and really believe this is so. There is as much knowledge and sympathy for the losers of history as the winners of history in these accounts. And Walter Benjamin's old thesis on history comes to mind. That is, there is no monument of history that is also, of civilization that is also not a monument of barbarism. One of Benjamin's theses on the philosophy of history reads, a Paul Klee painting named Angelus Novus shows an angel looking as though he is about to move away from something he is fixedly contemplating. His eyes are staring, his mouth is open, his wings are spread. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned towards the past, where we perceive a chain of events. He sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole that what has been smashed. but a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer clothe them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. The best history, I think, is written with this irony, this love of fate, this sadness or sense of the inevitable tragic loss that occurs in history, not epic triumphalist heroic marches of freedom, progress, or the rise of the West. And the end of Fernandez Amesto's book also evokes a similar spirit towards history, seeing it perhaps as a small walled garden in which you can find some relief from the rancour and mishaps of the world's events. In bringing this 4-part epic series on civilizations to a close, let me quote the final sentence from two sentences from Felipe Fernandez Amesto's great book on civilizations. After all the disillusionments with which the history of civilizations is studded, the triumphs of savagery, the bloodlettings of barbarism, the reversals of progress, the reconquests by nature, our failure to improve, there is no remedy except to go on trying and keeping civilized traditions alive, even on the beach and in the shingle. Il faut cultiver notre jardin. It is necessary to tend one's garden. Tending one's garden is to return to the root of processual change, the itch to civilize the small space I occupy, and fill it with the beauty or the best that has been thought and imagined, and drawing in my own unique way on all that survives of that. I hope you've enjoyed this long response to Isaac Rich's wonderful question about what is a cradle of civilization. I don't think Isaac quite expected a 4-hour plus marathon on that single question, but I hope you've also enjoyed the whole series responding to Isaac Rich's wonderful set of questions on games as a window onto history. And I hope you'll join me next time when I will be making a bit of a transition from civilizations to another topic, but having a bit of a look back at Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations and returning to some discussion of the current Russia-Ukraine war, now that we're no longer in an election period in Australia, and when perhaps some of the heat has come out of the discussion of the topic, and looking at the clash of civilizations revisited and the surprisingly foresightful commentary that Samuel Huntington had on Ukraine in his 1996 book. Okay, everyone, I hope you've enjoyed this long episode at the end of a long stretch on histories of civilizations, and I hope it's given you some thoughts and ideas for things to follow up and read and be inspired by, just the extraordinary examples of past human lives, as well as the encounters of different historians who have tried to make sense of them. Because, as we say at the Burning Archive podcast, the past is not dead, the past is not even past. And it's for that reason that one should always try to make sure that what one lovest well is not reft, will not be reft from thee. Bye now.